Hi, my name is Heavenly Harris, and for our final research project, I decided to discuss Abraham Lincoln's religion. Abraham Lincoln is undoubtedly one of the most popular U.S. presidents. He has been researched extensively. Every aspect of his life has been analyzed, including his faith. Michael Burlingame is a noted Lincoln scholar, and in an article about Lincoln's legacy, he does a good job of setting the stage for the inquiry regarding Lincoln's religious beliefs. He notes, and I quote, Lincoln's canonization began almost immediately. Within days of his death, his life was being compared to Jesus Christ. Lincoln was portrayed to a worshiping public as a self-made man, the liberator of the slaves and the savior of the Union, who had given his life so that others could be free. End quote. Comparing Lincoln to Jesus was not a difficult analogy for Americans to digest. Lincoln was well loved by many during his life and died tragically on Good Friday. Lincoln also used religious rhetoric extensively throughout his life, and his knowledge of the Bible rivaled that of many clergy. And still to this day, research shows that Lincoln has been cited in more sermons than any other president. When speeches like his second inaugural address are analyzed with the 21st century worldview, it would be logical to assume that the writer was religious, probably an evangelical Christian. However, by no means would this be an agreed upon conclusion. The debate about Lincoln's religious beliefs began almost immediately following his death. In 1866, Josiah Holland published a biography of Lincoln called The Life of Abraham Lincoln. William Herndon, who was Lincoln's longtime law partner, immediately criticized Holland, who himself was religious and described as pious, because Herndon believed that Holland had erroneously turned Lincoln into a true-hearted Christian. On the picture on the right is a picture of Herndon, and on the left is Holland. Having known Lincoln since the beginning of their partnership in 1844, Herndon felt the need to set the record straight and began researching information to counter the Christianity that Lincoln had been labeled with. Before the book was finished, Herndon gave a lecture to a crowd in Springfield, titling it Lincoln's Record, and proceeded to refute the proclamation that Lincoln was a Christian. In fact, he referred to him as an atheist, deist, infidel, and unbeliever. Since then, the debate has not ceased. In regards to the methodology for my inquiry, I decided to review recent books and articles published within the last 20 years or so, as most of them build on and review previous literature dealing with Lincoln's religious beliefs. I also wanted to examine a few primary sources, trying specifically to find ones that were not already included or referenced in articles, to see what people were saying at the time, and of course to look at Lincoln's own writings. Additionally, it's important for Christian historians to remain objective and honest throughout their investigation. When the sum of the research is analyzed, it's apparent that the debate centers around several accounts of people who noted that they believed that Lincoln underwent a religious transformation during his presidency, and the exhibition of that conversion in Lincoln's writings. There is little debate about Lincoln's lack of traditional Christian beliefs prior to the mid-1850s. While living in Springfield, Lincoln decided to run for the U.S. House of Representatives. Lincoln's opponent was a Methodist minister and openly contested Lincoln's unorthodox beliefs. It was pretty well known that Lincoln challenged parts of Scripture, things that were miraculous, for example, but also questioned God's affection for humans and intervention in human affairs, which is where the label deist comes in. Lincoln explained and defended his beliefs about religion in what he called the handbill replying to charges of infidelity, where he noted that he intended no disrespect of religion and would not support a candidate who was an open enemy of religion. However, he did not take the chance to affirm any of his own religious beliefs, acknowledging that he was not a member of a Christian church and that he had engaged in debates earlier in his life and championed the doctrine of necessity, which denies free will or the soul. So there's little controversy that Lincoln was, by most standards, an unbeliever in New Salem and his early Springfield days. However, several authors find evidence for a significant change in Lincoln during his presidency. Phipps describes how Lincoln became more open to attending church just prior to and during his presidency, even renting a pew at the Newark Avenue Presbyterian Church and attending regularly with his family. The pastor from the church, Dr. Phineas Gurley, often gave Lincoln counsel. Lincoln's private secretaries, John Hay and John Nicolay, wrote an extensive biography of Lincoln in the 1890s that, according to Guelzo, magnified the role of religion in Lincoln's life. Hay also shared a writing of Lincoln's which Hay admitted that was not intended to be shared, but what he thought was evidence of Lincoln's shifting view on God's attention to worldly events. In Lincoln's Meditation on the Divine Will, he notes that God's will regarding the Civil War shall prevail due to his sovereignty, and he affirms that God has the power to influence humans in accordance with God's purpose. You can see here a difference from the man who assumed that the events of the world were not impacted by their creator or his will. Frank Robbins was a pastor and gave a sermon, one of many, after Lincoln's death. Robbins attests to the numerous admirable character traits of Lincoln and concludes that he must have earned his reward in heaven. Robbins does not shy away from the topic of Lincoln's personal faith and resolves that the 16th president was a Christian. He justifies this assertion with second-hand testimony and and I quote, the Christ-like quality of forbearance toward his enemies, which in our view are only to be found in the character of a man of God. He also notes that, and I quote, all his state papers breathe the very spirit of reverence and trust, especially the later ones. One of these papers, which I found to be the source of much of the speculation on the subject of Lincoln's transformation, was his second inaugural address. According to Frederick Douglass, the second inaugural address sounded more like a sermon than a presidential address, and numerous scholars have analyzed it to discern if it demonstrated changes in Lincoln from his skeptical days in New Salem. In a book about presidents and democratic religion, one scholar highlights Lincoln's developing religious beliefs, noting its evolution from early rational deism to a mature theological position, featured most prominently in his second inaugural address. This reinforces the idea of a shift in beliefs. Gene Baker, who is an expert on Mary Todd Lincoln, wrote an interesting article which described how Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln influenced each other's religious beliefs. Mary was initially held traditional Orthodox Presbyterian beliefs, and Baker believed this influenced Lincoln, while Mary Lincoln actually became more skeptical throughout her life. Nicholas Perillo also believes there was a significant change in Lincoln and proves this by comparing the Republican rhetoric that dominated his writings prior to his presidency to those during his tenure, including the second inaugural. Perillo believes that Lincoln made a Calvinist transformation during his presidency. In a book about the faith of 11 U.S. presidents, Gary Smith comes to a similar conclusion. Lincoln's beliefs changed as he grew older from the skepticism of his youth, and, I quote, over time he became more receptive to Protestant orthodoxy, and his view of God became more Calvinist and conventionally Protestant. Calhoun and Morell even go so far as to claim that by the end of his life, Abraham Lincoln believed in a personal sovereign God. Their 2012 article contains an extensive review of what many Lincoln scholars have concluded about the president's beliefs and whether those scholars believe that Lincoln's views changed during the war. They also address an important argument. What if Lincoln used the religious language of his second inaugural address for purely political reasons? I think this is a valid concern, especially today. However, they are able to successfully refute this claim by noting that if Lincoln did want to tailor his message to make his audience happy, he would not have used such language of condemnation to the North for their role in slavery and complicity in the Civil War. This doesn't really fit the please the public agenda of the people that claim that Lincoln was just using this for rhetorical purposes. In regarding to explaining why the transformation happened, most scholars attribute it to the death of his two children, or in the case of Smith, the responsibilities, pressures, trials, and tribulations of the presidency, which Smith notes routinely cause U.S. presidents to rely on their faith. It is clear that the second inaugural address, which emphasized God's providence and perfect judgment, stands in stark contrast to the handbill, which was the only time Lincoln ever justified his personal beliefs in writing. However, before I label Lincoln a Christian, I need to take my own bias into account. Throughout my research, several scholars, Calhoun and Morell for example, criticized other secular historians who were quick to dismiss any change in Lincoln's beliefs, presumably because of their own bias about Christianity. And I can see their point. For a scholar who is not a Christian, it may be difficult to comprehend how such a logical man such as Abraham Lincoln could believe in something as seemingly irrational as the resurrection. But for many, including I think many taking this course, who are both scholars and Christian, it is not problematic for us to see how one can be both. I think several of the historians cited thus far fit into this category. They have sought to methodically demonstrate and explain how Lincoln's beliefs did move toward a more traditional Orthodox Christian theology. And I hope after all of the evidence I've presented, that shift is clear to you as well. That being said, I think I must lean toward Mark Noll's conclusions that even though Lincoln did alter his beliefs, he was not a born-again Christian. While we can successfully refute the assertions of atheism and deism, if we are objective, Lincoln does not fit the modern-day definition of an evangelical Christian. Noll also offers another important contribution to the study of Lincoln's faith, in that just because Lincoln may not have ascribed to the same biblical truths that many of us in this class hold, that does not mean he did not have something to teach us about the application of our faith. I think it is only appropriate that I end with a sentence from the source of the debate over Lincoln's religion, his second inaugural address, as well as with a lesson that Noll imparts that we should take seriously much of the advice Lincoln had to offer. So I'll close with the last line from the address. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in what is right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace amongst ourselves and with all nations.